Welcome back, friends. I hope you guys are all enjoying the new HDR plugin for Luminar NEO. In this video, I'm going to cover 7 great hints and tips to really get the most out of this new powerful tool. I'm going to show you how you can control the amount of the HDR effect, how we can save ourselves time with the processing, how we can use it to add even more detail, and stay tuned to the end because the last tip is probably the most important because it's all about how to prepare our files ready for the HDR merge rather than just drag and drop. There's a few things you might want to do if you really want to get the absolute best quality out of the HDR merge. So tip number 1 is really useful. How can we fade the effect of the HDR merge? Let's take a look at that. So this is our base photo, which is a prime candidate for HDR because we have no detail in the shadows whatsoever, whereas in the brighter photograph here, we start to see more of that information. And you can tell that this is 2 stops brighter thanks to the information box here saying we have a +2 exposure value. We also have one which is a -1 EV. So this photo is 1 stop darker and it's great for the area where the sun is setting here. So all we need to do is come back into the catalog mode, select the 3 photos, and we're just going to drag and drop them into HDR Merge, click Merge, and the HDR Merge plugin is going to work its magic, and by the time it's finished, it will spit out the combined photo, which will appear here in the HDR Merge folder. And there we go, we've got a pretty authentic HDR Merge. And for all intents and purposes, the color, the tonal range is pretty good. But what if we decide that HDR look, it's just a little bit too much and we want to dial it back? Currently, as of time of recording, we don't have an amount slider. However, there is a solution, which some of you smart folk may have already guessed, and it's going to involve using layers to bring in the HDR merged version along with one of our original frames. And we're going to choose the best one and bring them together. But what is very important is the order in which we do it. Let's take a look. So now we have our merged HDR image. All we need to do is come to the layers section on the top left, click the plus icon, click it again, and then come down and locate the original frame you want to reintroduce. I'm going to select the mid exposure, click the layer, and Luminar is going to load that up with the default 50% opacity. And now if I grab the opacity slider, we can either hide the HDR version and go back to our original, or bring it back down and we see the HDR version. So this slider is now effectively an amount slider, allowing us to reveal or hide our HDR merge. If we want to get the most out of this technique, we need to unlock the develop raw features. And currently, when you introduce a new layer, you do not have access to develop raw, only develop. And so if we wanted to favor the original and we came into develop, we don't have access to that lovely rich raw data. So the correct way to do this is start working on the raw file, and then you're going to load in the HDR photo as a separate layer. You've then got your HDR layer sat on top of that original, and again you can just vary the opacity to bring back how much you do or don't want of the HDR effect. Tip number 2, use HDR Merge on a single image. So up till now you've got a whole load of photos, but you've never shot a bracketed set in your life. No problem, we can still feed a single image into the HDR plugin and it's still going to create a nice HDR Merge for us. Now a couple of points to bear in mind: feeding in a RAW file rather than a JPEG is certainly going to give us superior results, obviously because the HDR plugin is going to have more dynamic range and latitude to actually get its teeth into to actually create that HDR Merge. Also, absolutely this works on a single frame and you're going to get more information in your shadows and in your highlights. However, of course, you're going to get the best results when you actually feed a true bracketed set into the system. It's a rough and ready approach, but you still get some pretty good results. Let's take a look. If we look at the thumbnail strip down here, we can see that this photo is actually part of a bracketed set, and that is how I photograph pretty much all of my landscapes. However, let's pretend it's not. It's just a single image. All we do is just drag it up to the HDR merge like we would normally, click merge, and it's as simple as that. HDR Merge has done its thing. If we jump into the HDR Merge folder, and now you can see we have a detail-rich HDR version of the photo, all based off of that single image. And if I jump back to the HDR examples and open up the original photo, jump into the edit section, and I can demonstrate this correct ordering from tip number 1. We double click on the layer of the HDR Merge TIFF, and now I just click it one more time, and Luminar is going to load it over the top of this one with 50% opacity. So if I grab the amount slider, you can see that this is our HDR merged image from that single photo that we put into the plugin, and this is our original when I drop the opacity back, and so you can blend the two together with the exact amount that you want. And if I want to refine the underlying raw photo, I can absolutely do that by selecting that in the layers palette over here. And now when I come to the develop section, I still have access to develop raw, which is going to give us more information, more control in this file. So now if I use my / key to look at our before, this is our original, and our after with our HDR merge from a single frame. before and after. Obviously season it to taste to your preferences, but isn't that much more visually appealing? Now, if you're watching this video, I assume that you've already got the HDR plugin. However, if you don't, you like the look of it, I have a link in the description below, and whatever Skylum's current best deal is that they're running, you'll find that in that link, so go ahead and get that. Tip number 3, using HDR Merge for portraits. Now, if you watched my previous video, I mentioned that Merge to HDR probably isn't much use for portrait photographers. However, if you utilize the method I just showed you, where we're taking a single frame and running that through Merge to HDR, we can actually benefit and leverage from that detail that actually gets introduced into the file. Let me show you what I mean. Let's suppose this is the photo that we want to work on. You can see the softbox just in the top left corner here lighting her. However, I'm losing detail all through the lovely flowers, through her hair. What if I want to actually bring that back? Well, Merge to HDR can actually help. So all I need to do is grab the thumbnail of the photo, drag it over to HDR Merge, click Merge, and let Luminar do its thing. While that's still processing in the background, I can come over to the Edit module, I can come over to Layers. That loads my photo in as a raw file, so I've got access to all the amazing tools inside of Neo's Develop Raw. However, as a Kickstarter, what I want to do is bring back some of that HDR information. So I'm going to come over to the layers again, click the plus icon, and now sat waiting for me in the HDR Merge folder is the photo of Bella, which I double click. That's going to load into the layers palette, and I click it once. And now Luminar NEO loads that over the top for me. So if I grab the opacity slider and move that all the way to 100, you can see the overall effect probably isn't what we'd really want for a portrait, unless we're going for quite an illustrative look. However, I may want to just steal components of this. Absolutely, I could just drop the opacity and have a little bit of element from this. And I don't mind a mild application, let's say about 24%. But what if I want to actually bring in more detail around here? All I'd need to do is just duplicate this layer. We can crank that all the way to 100 for now, and I'm just going to come into the masking section. Let's grab a brush for now, bring my strength down so I can build the effect up, click and just start painting a mask, and when I let go, the HDR layer is going to be reintroduced with whatever percentage or strength I'm painting this in at. So at the moment I'm just going over her hair, going over the flowers, maybe go over her jawline a little, and if we want to see more detail in her arm, we'll just click and paint there. So if I come down to the eyeball tool, we can see our original raw file, and when I release that, that is with the introduction of that Merge to HDR file that we created, and we can actually turn this layer off by hiding that. So that was precisely painted in with a mask, and this layer here, which I'm also going to hide, that was just an overall introduction of the HDR file at about 24%. I can also see this approach working really well for black and white photos where contrast is king. So we're on to tip number 4, how to add even more detail with a double application of Merge to HDR. Oh, Anthony, you're so crazy. A double application. Let me show you what I mean. We have 1, 2, 3 photographs here that I'm going to drag into HDR Merge. I'm going to open up my gear icon here. I have auto alignment set, which is perfect because I wasn't on a tripod, and I'm just going to close that down, click Merge, and away we go. And this is our resulting HDR file, which looks pretty good. But let's say we want even more detail around the foreground here, perhaps around this little reflection of the tree. Well, what are we going to do? Let's just grab the HDR merged file and drag that in. So when we click Merge now, we're going to double down on that effect. We're going to do an HDR merge to the HDR merge. Now, before I click on it, I'm going to give you a heads up. It's probably going to look pretty gnarly. However, I'm not concerned about the overall look. I'm just wondering, can I steal certain elements from it? So here we go. I'm going to click on it. 3, 2, 1. Bang, there you go. Okay, we've got a lot more detail in the photo, but it's also heading a lot closer towards what I consider to be pretty vulgar HDR. But if we look around the edge of the puddle at the weed here, this is kind of interesting, and even on the rock formation as well. So how about we steal some of this detail and introduce that into the more realistic HDR version that we see here? Absolutely, let's do that. Let's jump into the edit section. We're in the layers, click the plus icon, plus again. Here's our over the top double processed version. Let's click open, and now we just need to click it, and let's push this all the way to 100 so we can see our original. So this is our double HDR version. This was our original HDR version. Let's use this as a base, so I'm just going to drag it down to the bottom. Now on the top we have our double down hyper version, and so we just need to come into the masking section, grab a brush, and I'm going to paint this in with 41%, that's fine. Click and drag, and now I'm just going to paint around the edge. Go around one more time. Let's go over the middle bit and maybe a little bit over the rocks. You guys get the idea. I'm just introducing a double HDR version specifically where I want it. So this is our original mid exposure, this is our HDR merge, and this is our result selectively doubling down on that HDR effect. Tip number 5, let's save some time. As you've already seen, being able to use that merged HDR file with multiple applications can be a real time saver because we're not having to actually go in, move the shadow slider, highlights, and try and recover things, mask things. It's doing a lot of that heavy lifting for us. However, if we're feeding into the plugin multiple exposures and asking it to blend that seamlessly, we're asking a lot of our processor, and that can take time. So what can we do to speed things up? The first thing you could do to speed things up is remove some of the brackets. So for example, I shoot a lot of bracketed sets in series of 5. So I have a base exposure, one that's 2 stops under, one that's 1 stop under, one that's 1 stop brighter, and one that's 2 stops brighter. So I have a set of exposures that spans a range of 5 different exposures. So what I could do is actually just keep the very darkest photo, the mid exposure, and the very brightest photo, and ditch the 2 that sit in between, and I will still get a very similar HDR merge at the end of it. Forget RAW and just merge JPEGs. But wait, didn't you just say you should always shoot RAW? Yes, I did. However, if you're sending enough information via those JPEGs into the plugin, so let's say you have a bracketed set of 7 different JPEGs and you send them in, the end result that the HDR Merge plugin spits out is actually going to be pretty much indistinguishable from the version that you send in with RAW files. So if your processor is really struggling and time is of the essence, maybe just consider sending some JPEGs into the plugin rather than RAW files. Somebody asked me in the comments the other day, why don't you just leave auto align on all the time? And there's a good reason for that. Again, processing time. If you're asking the plugin to assess differences in the positioning and alignment, that's more computational work that it's got to do. So I'd strongly recommend focusing on the technical aspects of capturing your series of bracketed exposures perfectly on a nice solid tripod, and then you can just always turn auto alignment off without a worry. And then if now and again you see a little discrepancy in the alignment, and if that's the case, just re-render that merged HDR with auto alignment turned on. Simple. The same principle holds true for ghosting. If you don't have anything moving in your scene when you captured it, just turn ghost removal off, and that's going to save your processor. Tip number 6 is to boost your dynamic range even further. Let me show you how to do that. So you guys recall this HDR merge from a previous tip, but if we look at the shadows, you can see we don't really have too much in the way of rich data and information in those shadows. And if I jump back to the HDR examples, the originals, you can see we're kind of limited by the fact that we only have a bracketed set of 3. We can only bring back highlights based on our very darkest exposure, being this one here, and we can also only bring back shadow detail based on our very brightest exposure here. So here's my workaround. The first thing we're going to do is just select the 3 photos, right click, and we're going to go to export. Although a 16-bit TIFF is a much more data rich file, I found from my experiments that as long as we export with a high quality JPEG, that will actually suffice. And I'm going to hit export, and so when that's finished we'll have these 3 photos available to us as JPEGs for the HDR merge. So now it's done that, I'm just going to open up the brightest exposure, come into the edit section, and I'm going to come down to the develop raw section and boost the exposure up by 1 stop. As you can see, that's lifted in more details into the shadows, and now if I export this, I'm going to have access to use this in our HDR merge. If we wanted to, we could grab the exposure slider and boost up and do another version. This isn't really necessary, but why not? And then if we jump into the darker version, we'd be able to come in and create another version that was slightly darker than this one, but currently you can see that we have all of the highlight information that we need, so there really isn't any benefit to doing that. So now all we need to do is come into our folder where we placed those photos, and so unlike our original merge where we were passing 1, 2 and this brighter photo here, we now have an even brighter image and an even brighter image that's now 2 stops brighter than our previously very bright image. So now we just drag them into the HDR merge. We now have 5 different photos that we're bringing in, and even though they're JPEG rather than using RAW previously, I think we're going to see in our finished result we should have a lot more detail in those shadow areas. And now if we jump to the HDR merge folder where these are sent, and we look at the original version that was created using the 3 RAW files, and then we compare that with our new version where we introduced 2 brighter frames that we kind of artificially created and then fed them in, we've actually got a lot more detail, as you can see, going on in the shadow area if we compare that with our original. Those of you with a keen eye can probably spot a little bit of magenta fringing going along around the edge of this, and if you're like me and that's the kind of thing that bothers you, you're going to like the next tip. Pay attention guys, tip number 7 is a biggie. It is the most important one out of all of them if you want to get the best results from HDR Merge. It's all about sending the right information into the plugin so that you get the best results coming back out. This approach might not be for everybody because it does take a little bit more time to prep your files, but it's worth it if you want the best results. It all comes down to getting the file's foundations and optics right before we send them into the plugin. Let's take a look. Working with bracketed sets of differently exposed photos is really common in my architectural photography, and being able to combine those into one image is really important. Before we grab our set of differently exposed photos and drag them into the HDR Merge plugin, I've found the best practice is to get the foundations of our photo set right. So I'm just going to open up our base exposure here and I'm going to jump into the edit section. From here there are some key things that I'd like to do before I invoke our HDR Merge. Personally, I prefer to set a camera matching profile, so I'm going to go with camera neutral in this instance. I'm going to jump into the color section and make sure that I'm happy with my white balance. And then the next key area we want to look at is the optics, because this is what's going to allow us to actually turn on the auto distortion corrections, auto fix chromatic aberrations, and auto defringe. And the transformation section, which isn't always applicable, but for architectural work is an absolute must, we're going to set that as well. And that's it. I'm going to jump back to the catalog, right click, go into my adjustments and just synchronize those adjustments across the whole set. And now there's one more step we want to take. We don't want to just grab them and drop them straight into the HDR Merge tool, because that's actually going to render our result based on the original raw file, not the file that we've just made changes to. And so our workaround for this is to actually export the photos as they exist now. And I've just set up a temporary folder to hold these exports. So we need to add that folder we just created, and we need to come over and remove all of those photos we put in there before. Shift click on the last one so we can grab all 5, drag them in, click merge, and when that's finished processing, we should have a photo that's had all the optics corrected and serves as a really nice foundation for us to build our edit from. So this was our initial HDR merge, and this is with a very quick retouch. And if we compare that with our original base exposure, we're in a much better place with a really minimum amount of effort. Do let me know in the comments which your favourite tip has been, and if you've got any tips that you'd like to share with myself and others, please write those as well. This video came about purely because you guys requested it, so let me propose another idea. If you would like another video all about best practices of how to actually capture a series of bracketed photos that you can use for the HDR plugin, please let me know by writing shooting HDR in the comments below, and if I get enough requests, I'll put another video together all about that. So thank you so much for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next video.